our governments, with our tax money, are subsidizing this is insane to me. It's literally insanity.
We need concrete, tangible action.
Fossil fuel subsidies are like a massive leak in the pipeline of an economy.